On May 20th, 2025, nearly 25 years after the killing, Benjamin Ritchie was executed by lethal injection in Indiana. The murder was deliberate. A police officer gunned down in the line of duty. 4 bullets fired during a foot chase, one piercing just above the vest, ending the life of a father, a husband, and a 10-year veteran of the force. This is the story of that night, of what led up to it, what Ritchie did after, his final plea for mercy, his last meal, and his last words. Benjamin Ritchie was born on May 3, 1980, in Indiana. From the very beginning, Benjamin was marked by disadvantage. His biological mother, Marion Martin, struggled with substance abuse throughout her pregnancy. The result, a diagnosis of fatal alcohol spectrum disorder, a condition that would shadow him for the rest of his life. Shortly after his birth, Benjamin was abandoned by both his mother and her partner. He was left in a system that didn't know what to do with boys like him. Eventually, he was adopted by Werner and Oscar Ritchie. But love didn't erase the damage. Benjamin's home life remained chaotic. His adoptive parents struggled to discipline him, and Benjamin struggled to connect. He was often withdrawn, unpredictable, and volatile. At school, the pattern continued. Teachers reported impulsivity, mood swings, and violent outbursts. He repeated the first grade. By the 9th, he dropped out entirely. He couldn't keep up. By his late teens, Benjamin was already on the radar of local authorities. In 1998, at just 18, he was convicted of burglary. The sentence, probation. A warning, a chance. But the warning was ignored. What no one realized was that Benjamin Ritchie wasn't just a troubled kid. He was a ticking clock. And each arrest, each missed intervention, was a second lost. September 29th, 2000, Beech Grove, Indiana. A quiet evening spiraled into chaos. It started with a stolen car. Benjamin Ritchie, just 20 years old, had been spotted driving a red Chevrolet that didn't belong to him. When officers attempted to stop the vehicle, Ritchie didn't hesitate. He fled. What followed was a reckless pursuit through residential streets, one that ended in a narrow alleyway near 17th and Albany. The stolen vehicle crashed, and Ritchie ran. Officer William Toney gave chase. Toney, a veteran of the Beech Grove Police Department, was known for being calm under pressure. That night, he followed Ritchie on foot, believing perhaps that this would be just another arrest. As the two rounded a corner behind a home, Ritchie pulled a .380 caliber semi-automatic pistol. Without warning, he turned and fired 4 shots at Officer Toney. One of those bullets struck just above the protective edge of Toney's bulletproof vest, slipping through the fatal gap between armor and throat. The wound was devastating. He collapsed instantly. By the time backup arrived, it was already too late. Officer Toney, a 31-year-old father of 2, lay dying in the grass behind a stranger's home. Ritchie vanished into the night. The manhunt began immediately. Dozens of officers from surrounding departments joined the search, locking down neighborhoods and checking every tip. Just 24 hours later, police tracked Ritchie to a friend's residence on the south side of Indianapolis. He was hiding out, quiet, armed, and alone. Officers surrounded the home. There was no shootout. Ritchie surrendered without resistance. But the damage had already been done. News of Toney's death rippled through Indiana. Flags were lowered, uniforms draped in black bands. The funeral, held a few days later, was packed with officers from across the Midwest. Bagpipes played. A folded flag was handed to his widow. His 2 young children sat silently in the front row, their faces blank, caught between grief and disbelief. Investigators quickly pieced together the details. The car was indeed stolen. The firearm, unlawfully possessed. Ritchie had been on probation for burglary at the time, making his possession of a handgun a direct violation. But none of those infractions came close to what he had done in that alley. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't an act of panic. It was a decision. In the words of the prosecutor, it was a deliberate ambush, a ruthless act of self-preservation. The community called for justice, and the state promised to deliver it. In August 2002, nearly 2 years after the murder of Officer William Toney, Benjamin Donnie Ritchie finally stood before a jury. The charges were extensive: murder, auto theft, resisting law enforcement, and unlawful carrying of a firearm. But in truth, the trial revolved around one central question: should Benjamin Ritchie live or die for what he had done? The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case. They called it premeditated, cold-blooded. They pointed to Ritchie's record, his burglary conviction, his probation, his flight from justice. But more than anything, they focused on the moment Ritchie turned and pulled the trigger. They argued it was calculation, a decision made in seconds to value his freedom more than another man's life. The defense painted a different picture. They brought in testimony about Ritchie's past, how he was born with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, abandoned by his mother, raised in instability, and never received proper psychological care. They argued that his actions weren't born of evil, but of untreated trauma. But the jury didn't see a boy lost in the system. They saw the badge. They saw the widow. They saw the children left behind. On August 10th, 2002, the verdict was read: guilty on all counts. After deliberation, the jury returned with their recommendation: capital punishment. 2 months later, on October 15th, 2002, the judge made it official. Benjamin Donnie Ritchie was sentenced to die by lethal injection. After his sentencing in 2002, Benjamin Ritchie was transferred to the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. There, in a narrow cell, he began the slow march toward execution. Like others on death row, Ritchie lived under strict isolation. 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, 1 hour in a fenced-in yard, no physical contact. But behind the bars, Ritchie's story didn't disappear. In the years that followed, his case drew attention. Ritchie was featured in multiple true crime and prison documentaries exploring the lives of death row inmates. To some, he appeared as a symbol of America's unforgiving justice system. To others, he was simply a murderer, granted more visibility than he deserved. Yet even in that darkness, Ritchie found connection. During his incarceration, he began a long-distance relationship with a woman from Sweden. They met through a prison pen pal program and communicated through letters, calls, and rare in-person visits. Their relationship became public years later when she shared their story in a series of interviews and blog posts, describing Ritchie as soft-spoken, intelligent, and misunderstood. To her, he wasn't a killer. He was a man shaped by abandonment and trauma, a man who had spent more time in a cell than in the world. Whether it was love, obsession, or a shared sense of isolation, only they truly knew. But as the execution date loomed closer, the relationship took on a strange intensity. She remained his most vocal supporter, and he in turn left behind poems, letters, and handwritten reflections that offered a rare glimpse into the mind of a man waiting to die. The road from conviction to execution in America is rarely short. For Benjamin Ritchie, it lasted nearly 23 years. His legal team filed multiple petitions over the decades. Their arguments centered on two main claims: ineffective assistance of counsel during his original trial, and the long-ignored effects of his mental health conditions, particularly fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. They pointed to neurological evaluations, developmental delays, and behavioral red flags that had been overlooked or minimized in court. But the courts weren't convinced. Each appeal was reviewed. Some made it as far as the Indiana Supreme Court. Others stalled in federal courtrooms, but the outcome never changed. The conviction stood, the sentence held, and the clock kept ticking. By early 2025, Ritchie had exhausted nearly all his legal options. Only one path remained: clemency. In May, just weeks before his scheduled execution, Ritchie appeared before the Indiana Parole Board. It was a final, formal plea for mercy. He sat across from a panel of decision-makers, hands folded, voice steady. For the first time in years, he spoke publicly about what he had done. "I'm sorry," he told them, "for the pain I caused, for the life I took, for the family I destroyed. I'm sorry for everything." He acknowledged the murder of Officer William Toney. He called it a moment of terror and stupidity, born out of panic, fear, and a life spiraling out of control. But the board had heard similar stories before. They reviewed his record. They weighed the crime. They looked at the legal documents, the neuropsychological reports, the letters of support, and then they voted. The decision was unanimous. Clemency denied. The case was passed to Indiana Governor Mike Braun, and on May 14, 2025, the governor issued his final statement. After carefully reviewing the unanimous recommendation from the State Parole Board, I have decided to allow the execution of Benjamin Ritchie to proceed as planned for May 20th. The execution would proceed. The date, May 20th, 2025. Inside Indiana State Prison, preparations move forward with clinical precision. Ritchie, now 45, had spent over 2 decades on death row. On the night before his execution, Ritchie was allowed a final visit with a spiritual advisor and members of his family. For hours, they talked behind glass. One last exchange before the state ended what the courts had confirmed. His final meal was a plate from Olive Garden's tour of Italy: chicken parmesan, lasagna, and fettuccine alfredo. He ate quietly, alone. Just after midnight on May 20th, 2025, he was secured to the gurney. Witnesses, including members of Officer William Toney's family, sat behind a pane of glass. On the other side, Ritchie lay still, arms strapped down, eyes open. When asked if he had any final words, he spoke simply, "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I've gotten. I hope they all find peace." Then he turned his head slightly and nodded. "I'm ready." The warden gave the signal. A series of drugs began to flow through the IV lines. Within moments, Ritchie's chest slowed. His lips parted. His eyes closed. At 12:46 a.m., Benjamin Donnie Ritchie was pronounced dead. For the state of Indiana, justice had been served. For the family of Officer William Toney, a chapter had ended. And for Ritchie, the long countdown was over.